Hi everyone, really good to see you all today. I'm going to start this webinar by doing a session on the background and context of preparing for adulthood. I know that quite a lot of you will know this, and I really apologise for that, but we always think it's a really good idea to cover the basics, start from the beginning of the story just to set the context so that the rest of the session we know that everybody's got those basics about preparing for adulthood. So apologies to those of you who are very familiar with preparing for adulthood. So in 2014, we had the new Children and Families Act, which includes the SEM reforms. And the reason that we needed new legislation around SEM was because there was a lot of evidence by the time the coalition government came to power that there were a lot of problems in the system, and particularly around outcomes. So we had a lot of evidence that young people, particularly those with the most complex needs, have very poor outcomes from the system. And when it said outcomes, this was really around employment, where so very, very few young people left education with jobs. Independent living, where we had the evidence that lots of young people really wanted to be more independent, but we had young people staying in the family home and then remaining there until middle age and beyond. And also lots of young people living in quite restrictive environments, residential settings and so on. And then we also knew that lots of young people really wanted to have friends, relationships, and get out and about in their communities and weren't able to. And there was also a lot of evidence that young people with SEND weren't supported very well into adulthood around their health. There was also a lot of evidence that we weren't really basing our interventions and support on evidence. Probably one of the biggest examples of that is the research that the Institute of Education have been doing for a number of years now around the use of learning support assistants, when they found that children were being prevented from social inclusion, and also their learning was impacted if learning support assistants were not part of the overall teaching team in the classroom, and the learning support assistant was stuck next to the child. So that's one example, but there are others. Brian Lamb's report into parental satisfaction with the SEN system found that parents really weren't satisfied and that they felt they had to fight for the support they needed for their child. And then finally, we had evidence of silo working, which led to mixed messages to children, young people and families, a lack of coherent planning and a duplication of effort. So the new system has a completely different focus. The focus is now on outcomes. And obviously to achieve good outcomes, we need person-centred and holistic joined-up practice. We now have the opportunity to publish a local offer which really sets out the local area's vision and around SEND and where its strategy's at, what the future developments will be, so that everybody working in the system, as well as families and young people, know what to expect, what the provision available is, etc. A new focus on high quality teaching and learning. The whole underpinning of the new legislation is around aspirations. So we knew that often we didn't have high aspirations for many children with SEND. And now it's really about making sure that we're pushing and challenging and ensuring that young people have the support and high aspirations that they should have. And then there's preparing for adulthood. Preparing for Adulthood has its own chapter in the Code of Practice. It's chapter 8, but it's also mentioned in every chapter. So this is a graphic representation of the Preparing for Adulthood pathways. They came about through a programme that was running between 2008 and 2011, and we worked with 400 young people, mostly with severe learning disabilities or profound learning difficulties and or autism. So we had 3 years of working with them and their families and the people working in the local systems, and our commission from the department was to find out why young people were not going into employment. This was part of the National Valuing Employment Strategy. We were asked to work with 12 areas across the country with young people and families to find out why more young people weren't going into employment. But fairly soon they said, well, we want to get jobs, but can you also think about the rest of our lives? And so these pathways were co-produced with those young people, 400 young people and their families. And if you think about it, these are the pathways we're all on. This is really what makes up all of our lives. And pathways are really important because they help us to remember that children and young people with SEND have the same aspirations, needs and rights as all young people. They help us to remember what a good life is. It helps us to remember that young people with SEND want the same things as everybody else. And if we're going to find out what young people's aspirations is, we do need to use person-centred practice to genuinely find out what's important to them now and in the future. And then we can put the right support in place. The pathways help us to think about education targets that are going to help to support the young person to achieve their outcomes and move towards their aspirations. So this is a very brief list. It's certainly not everything that young people have told us, but basically it's just another reminder that young people with disabilities and special needs do want the same as everybody else. So what we need to really be aware of is that if we're going to write really good outcomes in EHC plans, we need to be aware of what works. And this is a summary of really what works around employment. So we must plan from year 9. We've now got the opportunity with the Education, Health and Care Plan to include aspirations about employment in Part A of the plan. We then need to develop vocational profiles so we get a clear understanding of what kind of employment would work for a young person. Ideally, this should be happening through year 10 so that the young person can have successful, meaningful work experience in the community in year 11. Ideally, we want to make sure the curriculum is supporting planning for employment. We now have the Gatsby benchmarks, which make it clear that every young person, including those with high needs, have got a right to differentiated careers advice and a career curriculum. We need to make sure that families particularly get good welfare rights advice so that they know that employment is possible and they understand the interface with the benefit system. And the place and train model works. So what this means is we learned from many years of running courses in post-16 provision for young people with SEND, which were often called preparing for employment or employability, but few young people went into employment. And so what we know is that, like everybody else, we learn on the job. So similarly, for independent living, the evidence is that we must plan from year 9. Independent living is not about doing everything on your own, and it's not about what has traditionally been understood. It's really about having a voice, being an autonomous adult, having a right to make your own decisions and get the right support to do that. Again, we need to make sure that in the curriculum we're including things that young people with SEND need to know about housing options and support. We need to help young people with SEN to have the same opportunities as other young people, to have time away from home, and ideally as they get older, overnight. We need to make sure that from year 9, ideally at the year 9 review, we are giving families and young people information about housing and support options. And we need to get better at introducing young people when they're still at school to older people in the community who have got great lives. And then with friends, relationships and community, we need to intentionally support young people to have friendship circles. We need to get better at making sure that school forums include disabled young people or young people with SEM. We need to, for young people who need support around inclusion and social inclusion and friendships, we have a good tool called the Inclusion Web that we're going to share with you later. Planning for travel is important if we want somebody to have a great life, to get out and about in the community. We need to think about travel, which is obviously also important for independent living and employment. We need to make sure that young people know how to keep in touch with friends and other people that they want to through telephoning, texting and social media if that's appropriate for them. And adult relationships, part of the new RSHE curriculum. There's a lot of activity going on around the country to make sure that young people with SEND are included and get support around sex and relationships and adult relationships as they get older. And again, just a reminder that we need to think about what's important to all young people. Health, again, we need to plan from year 9. We need to make sure that young people's health needs are clearly documented in their EHC plans or their SEN support plans, whether that's physical health needs, medical needs, or mental health needs. And it's a really good idea for young people who have got complex communication to have a communication passport and a decision-making agreement to make sure that we are promoting their well-being and their mental health. So just some examples here. This aspiration is actually quite common. It often is brought in from families whose nightmare is that their son or daughter will be socially isolated when they get older. And it's about making sure that we support young people to have friends and be part of their community. So this is an aspiration that's in part A of a plan, and the outcome, once we talk through the baseline and what was achievable and possible, is very smart, and it's about going out with friends to do certain activities of mutual interest. So the Code of Practice says that we must also include the steps that are going to happen to achieve those outcomes. So in this example, first of all, we need to identify the barriers to social relationships. What is this about? Is it about a young person's social communication needs? Is it about behaviour? Is it just that this hasn't been thought about before, whatever those barriers may be? And then let's think about how to identify young people who have got similar interests. So it could be other young people in school, it could be in the family, or it could be in the community. And let's think about the support that is available to support that young person to do those, or those young people to do those things. So are we going to use a personal budget to employ a support worker to support those young people to do those activities? Or is it going to be through organised support that's available in the community? Or is it possible through current provision? Let's identify the activity that's going to be most successful. So what is it this young person likes doing best? What's their favourite activity? And let's plan for that to happen first, so we build in success. And then let's plan the activity, do the activity and review it. And then we can show how the education, health and care targets fit into those life outcomes and support the steps. So in this example, the young person will be using photographs to identify other young people that they like or they get on with, or they may want to do activities out of school with. This can be supported if there are issues around behaviour through strategies advised by the psychologist and occupational therapist, so that when the young person goes out, the support worker has got absolutely up-to-date and clear information about what strategies to use to support the activity. And then in terms of social care, if there's a personal budget, that can be used to recruit the right sort of personal assistant with similar interests to support these activities.